season wraps up here, and we're going into bowl season, and we're going into the college football playoff. I was kind of asking myself in terms of what are some of the sort of underrated storylines that go into this 2025 offseason. And one of the first ones that immediately came to mind, at least for me, was the USC Trojans. And I've talked about them a little bit on this program, and going to the first year in the Big Ten, and obviously it's a big transition. I mean, you committed $100+ million to Lincoln Riley, had success in his first year, lost the Pac-12 title game to Utah, and then this year it was sort of a spitball of just highs and lows in many ways. Because you sit there and you say to yourself, I remember that week 0 matchup against number 13 ranked LSU where they won 27-20, and you kind of sat there and said to yourself, man, this defense looks a hell of a lot better than it did last year. There was actually some sort of pass rush this year. The secondary is playing halfway decent. You saw Miller Moss made some incredible throws. And then as the season progresses along, obviously the Michigan game was a pretty heartbreaking loss. And then to me, where everything kind of really went in the wrong direction was that 29-28 Maryland loss towards the end of the season there. For me, that was kind of the game where I sat there and said to myself, okay, there's definitely some problems lurking in USC. But I think the thing about USC that I think a lot of people are kind of underestimating is I think this is a deeper problem than just recruiting. I mean, obviously recruiting is obviously the bread and butter and everything, but the thing about Lincoln Riley, and I put one of his quotes in the ticker down below, but one of the things he's been kind of preaching is, hey, like, I have this vision, and you at the end of the day, you just kind of have to believe me on it. And for those of you who didn't cover Lincoln Riley much in Oklahoma, I mean, his model was pretty much, hey, we're just going to get people in the portal and kind of hope for the best. And clearly that hasn't worked. I mean, the part of it too is, yes, you've brought in some pretty solid recruiting classes. I mean, I go back and think of the 5-star Zachariah Branch, and even his brother committed for a short period of time too, but those guys have transferred out. The stat line that I have is 19 prospects were in the 2023 class, and only 9 of them transferred out. So you're kind of sitting there thinking to yourself, okay, you're having this max exodus of players transferring out. You're struggling to recruit in California right now, much like UCLA is having a very similar problem in that regard too. But obviously they're obviously a little bit of a rebuild, so that's a little bit of a different story. But when you look at USC, you kind of ask yourself, you have the tradition of being one of the most prestigious programs in all of college football. I mean, you go back, and I think in the early 2000s, and I was a kid with Matt Larned and Reggie Bush and Pete Carroll and all those guys. Those are the people that obviously you get excited about hearing. And then you say to yourself, hey, you committed a lot of money in Lincoln Riley. You kind of had some dud coaches, in that past decade in between. But there's a couple things that I think really have to kind of come together for USC in order for them to really put it together too. I think first and foremost, these calls for Lincoln Riley to get fired, I think are quite frankly premature. Do I think he deserves to be criticized? 100% he deserves to be criticized. I mean, when you're getting paid $100+ million and get a 10-year deal, I mean, you expect results immediately. And when you have 19 guys transfer out, I mean, that's just it's a testament to what's going on in your program. And again, too, people will argue, well, everybody's transferring, everybody's wanting the bigger payday. That's fine, but it's about the 5-star guys and 4-star guys, particularly guys within the Southern California region, that I believe is the bigger issue in terms of guys transferring too. But again, too, when you're preaching culture and you're preaching this vision that Lincoln Riley's kind of talking about, it makes you second guess too, because at the same time too, they do have this bowl game versus Texas A&M, which could be another way to sort of advertise your program in some regard, even though a lot of people nowadays don't really believe in the bowl games as much. But at the same time too, I mean, the big thing too is, I think what people don't give USC enough credit for is they are progressing in a number of different ways. I think the defense has been a lot better than you give them credit for. Aside from the Maryland loss, I talk about the Penn State loss, which quite frankly is a game that I would argue that they should have won, especially how strong they came out in the first half. And at least in my opinion too, I think Miller Moss is a lot better of a quarterback than people give him credit for. I think it was more of a Miller Moss didn't necessarily fit Lincoln Riley's scheme. Not so much that Miller Moss is a bad quarterback. I mean, granted, towards the end of the year, yes, he had some questionable decision making, and I think you can argue that the offensive line could have been a little bit better for him. But I think he had plenty of weapons there. I mean, when you have a guy like Zachariah Branch and all those dudes too, you have enough of those pieces to be creative in terms of the play calling and whatnot. And you have a guy like Lincoln Riley who is a great offensive mind and understands the X's and O's and has coached a number of very solid programs too. So you kind of have to ask and say to yourself too, USC didn't really have a cupcake schedule or anything. I mean, even when you look at their non-conference schedule, I mean, you sit there and say to yourself, hey, they played Notre Dame. They played Notre Dame at the very last game of the year, and that game was 49-35, and that game was a lot closer than I think people give them credit for too. I mean, obviously, Mariova is a younger guy and is probably somebody that you can work with. I'm not even sure if he's transferred yet, but at the same time too, USC has always been one of those programs where they're kind of streaky, right? Where they won their first 3 out of 4, then they lost their next 3, and then they kind of flip flopped back and forth from there. But even too, that's just part of being in the Big Ten is you're going to be playing teams like Wisconsin every year, Minnesota, who I think is a lot tougher than people give them credit for. They had that Washington loss, which obviously in between the Maryland game too was definitely pretty devastating too. And I'd like to know too that a majority of these games were on the road too. And when you struggle against teams like Maryland, Washington, and even UCLA, I would argue, even though all those games on the road, at the same time, those are teams that you have to beat in order. If you're making $100 million a year, you have to be able to beat those teams. That's just plain and simple, just kind of the way it is. But at the same time, too, USC gives you all of the ability to be able to get guys on your board. They're going into NIL. To me, it's just kind of inexcusable in terms of what seems to be the issue here. But I think there are some positives here. I mean, granted, you're going to have to attack the Southern California region a lot harder. I'm going to imagine that you're going to have to at least hit the portal pretty hard, and particularly in the quarterback position. I think you're going to have to definitely tweak that a little bit, maybe get it more of a senior guy there. So I'm kind of intrigued in terms of who's out there. But now you're kind of saying to yourself, well, hey, Connor Wegman's gone. I think Michael Van Buren could have been a really good fit there, but he decided to transfer to LSU to back up Garrett Nussmeier in his senior year. But ultimately, too, does USC have some things going for him? Yeah, they do. I mean, when you have a guy like Lincoln Riley, who's a really creative mind, you have a solid staff there. D'Anton Lynn has shown that they're making at least progress on the defensive front, so it doesn't feel so much like they're a one-sided football team. But I think most importantly, it's the whole recruiting thing that you have to figure out. I mean, granted, I think there are some extra layers to this, not just recruiting, but that's obviously going to be the big talking point, right? And that's one of those things that even Lincoln Riley's been criticized about at Oklahoma too, in the sense of instead of trying to find the longer vision and being able to really develop these guys, his sort of mindset has always been, hey, we're just going to plug in, use the portal, and see what's going on too. But at least what another thing that he has going for him too is a lot of the athletic directors and the president all are committed to his vision and quite frankly have backed him. I mean, obviously you hear the threats and the worry of, oh, Lincoln Riley's on the hot seat, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, 7-5 is really not the ideal season. But, when you look at the schedule too, it wasn't no cupcake schedule. But at the same time too, I think what worries you is quite frankly these games that they should be winning by 2 or 3 possessions is kind of turning into one lot, one score games, or quite frankly situations that they shouldn't really be putting themselves in too. Because I think USC in many ways is a great hotbed for a lot of great talent too. I mean, California's you think of California, you think of Texas, you think of Florida in terms of pipelines, in terms of where the top athletes in the country are. You sit there and say to yourself, you play in one of the most beautiful campuses in all of college football. You have such a great prestige and program there. And Lincoln Riley, yes, has he deserved his fair amount of criticism? Absolutely. And I've criticized him on this show. However, there are some reasons to be able to not be totally pessimistic about him too. But I think if you're him, you kind of have to ask yourself, hey, have they hired a general manager yet who has excelled in recruiting in California? Do they have the ability to be able to plug in some guys that they're losing in the portal? Because as it stands right now, there definitely seems like there is a max exodus in terms of players leaving from one place to another too. But most importantly on the football field too, I think the other thing you kind of have to ask yourself too is how's that quarterback room going to be? Because I would argue that they're probably going to have to go with a younger guy this year, presumably, based on what they have in the quarterback room right now. And the other thing, obviously, too, is how do they bounce back from this? I mean, obviously they had the strong beginning of the season, beating LSU and beating Utah State, but then when you get into the losses, such as a Michigan game that quite frankly they should have won, the Penn State game that they would have won if they didn't give up three touchdowns in the second half, and then you think of the Maryland game and the Washington game too, and you kind of have to ask yourself, you know, when is it going to be that moment where they take it to the next level and become one of the premier teams in the Big Ten? But for now, all eyes are going to be on Lincoln Riley and being able to get this recruiting class in order, really hitting the transfer portal hard, addressing the questions that you have in the quarterback room, and then most importantly, can that progression that we've seen on the defensive side, while it's taking strides, to what extent will they be progressing going into 2025?